Thank you so much. What a huge pleasure to be here with you. I'm sorry I was a little slow getting on the call. I had to drive. I'm up in a very small town in Colorado in the mountains, and I had to drive 9 miles to get to a wireless connection, and I ran into a herd of cows on the dirt road into town. So, but I'm very happy to be with you all, and also very, very excited to know about this larger effort that you're engaging with in the Munich Science Communications Laboratory. I think it's really, really important for the field of planetary health, and we're excited to be learning from you all as this sort of adventure goes forward. I want to talk about what I call the science and the story, because my own reflection as I was listening to Sarah is that to effectively communicate the complexity of planetary health science requires a process in between of sort of synthesis and translation of the science into narrative and a story that the general public can actually make sense of. And so I want to start by talking to you about the science and giving the introduction I was asked to give about planetary health science. And then I think we're going to be showing a short video that we produced that is our sort of latest effort at turning that into an accessible narrative. And then I'll offer a few reflections about that process after we see the video. So planetary health, we need to start with a definition, is a transdisciplinary field, a very new transdisciplinary field that's focused on analyzing and addressing the human health impacts of anthropogenic disruptions of our planet's natural system. So it's about human health as it's impacted by our own disruption of our planet's natural systems. And I think it's really can only be well understood in the context of really a unique moment that we find ourselves in human history. By most metrics, there's never been a better time to be a human being. Over the last 75 years, we've seen really extraordinary improvements in most metrics of human development, from education, where the percentage of the global adult population that knows how to read and write has grown from 42% to 86%. To economic growth, where in 1950 there were 1.6 billion people in the world and 1.6 billion people living in extreme poverty, and 920 million who are not in extreme poverty. And 65 years later, there are 730 million people living in extreme poverty and 6.6 billion people not in extreme poverty. So in other words, in that 65-year period, the percentage of the global population living in extreme poverty has dropped from 62% to 10%, despite nearly tripling the global population, which is really an extraordinary development accomplishment. Human health has been improving really dramatically over that same period, with life expectancy rising from 46 to 72 years on average, and child mortality has fallen by a factor of 4 over the same period. So we've seen these really extraordinary improvements in human development, really in the space of one person's lifetime. But the same really exceptional sort of scientific and technological developments that have fueled this, vast improvement in sort of the human condition across the planet on average, has also been fueling this extraordinary expansion of our total ecological footprint, of our impact on our planet's natural systems. And these are graphs from work on the Great Acceleration, but essentially what we see is across really any metric of human consumption globally, whether we're looking at appropriation of fresh water or proliferation of motor vehicles or production and use of synthetic fertilizers, paper production, plastic production, energy use, we see these very similar curves with relatively modest consumption patterns up until 1950, and then these really, really steep, almost exponential increases in the scale of our consumption patterns. And not surprisingly, if you look at metrics of our impact across our planet's natural systems, you see very similar patterns over that same time period, whether you're looking at loss of biodiversity or appropriation of fisheries, addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, ocean acidification, or loss of tropical and also temperate forests. You see the same real acceleration in the impacts we're having across our natural systems. And the reason that all of those graphs look so similar is that they're all underlain by these two really fundamental processes. One is the growth in human population, the number of people that we're sharing the planet with. And starting in around 1900, we saw this gentle increase in human population with a really quite steep acceleration around 1950, leading right up until today in human population growth. What's less well understood is that per capita GDP growth has actually been even steeper than human population growth. So the amount of goods and services that each one of us is asking our planet to provide for us has been growing even faster than the human population. And when you multiply those two things together, you get total global GDP. And it's essentially almost a vertical line that we're sitting on top of. So it's hard to overstate the pace at which the human sort of global ecological footprint has been ballooning over just the last several decades. And as a result, we're having these extraordinary impacts across our planet's natural systems. In order to feed ourselves every year, we appropriate around 40% of the terrestrial land surface for croplands and pasture. We're using about half the accessible fresh water on the planet to irrigate, mostly just for irrigating our crops. We're fishing 90% of our monitored fisheries at or well beyond maximum sustainable limits. We've cut down around half the tropical and temperate forests on the planet, dammed over 60% of its rivers. As we all know, we're suffering from these growing issues of air, water, and land pollution really on a global scale now, experiencing obviously climatic disruption, and all of these kinds of anthropogenic disruptions across our planet's natural systems are now driving the sixth mass extinction of life on Earth. We're losing species at about 1,000 times the baseline rate. The population sizes of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians has fallen actually by 62% since 1970. And about 1 million species are now facing extinction, many within the next several decades. So this is a bleak and stark picture of the scale of our impacts across our planet's natural systems. The core premise of planetary health is that the scale of human activity now exceeds our planet's capacities to absorb the wastes that we're producing or provide the resources that we need sustainably. And as a result, our activities are transforming not just the climate system, but also biodiversity, biogeochemical cycles, land use and land cover, scarcity of resources like fresh water and arable land, and global pollution. And that all of these large-scale anthropogenic environmental changes are interacting with each other in complex ways that we're just beginning to understand, but that ultimately affect the core fundamental conditions for human well-being and the well-being for most of life on Earth. The quality of air that we breathe, the quality and quantity of food that we can produce, water quality, exposure to infectious diseases, exposure to extreme weather events, even the habitability of some of the places that we live. And we're starting to see the resulting impacts across every dimension of human health, as you can see illustrated. So we don't have a lot of time for me to go through what those impacts look like in any detail. That's the subject for that huge book that Michael John just showed you. But I want to give you just a few really quick examples, because just as we in the public health have started to understand over the last several decades that there are very important social and cultural and political determinants of human health, now we're coming to understand that there are also critical ecological determinants, that human health is actually nested in a set of ecological conditions. And as we change those biophysical conditions at the fastest rates in the history of our species, we're starting to see these impacts across each dimension of health. And so a few really quick examples. My own research at the Harvard School of Public Health is focused on things like how rising carbon dioxide levels are making our food less nutritious and pushing potentially hundreds of millions of people into risk for micronutrient deficiencies of things like iron and zinc and also protein. We've been doing work on how declines in insect pollinators are leading to about 500,000 excess deaths a year because of inadequate production of foods like fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds and legumes that protect us from the non-communicable diseases, heart disease and stroke and some cancers. We're learning from other research that there are huge shifts in exposure to infectious disease. Obviously, we're going through this pandemic now, which is a manifestation of a risky relationship between human beings and wildlife. And there have been many other spillover events leading to smaller outbreaks of infectious diseases, but also simply changes in land use and land cover. 400 million people in West Africa or across Africa at risk for schistosomiasis because of damming of rivers and what that does ecologically and how it affects the snail populations and ultimately exposure to schistosomiasis. And there are hundreds of other examples like that. We're seeing something like 9 to 11 million excess deaths a year from global pollution. And whether it's air, water, or soil pollution, all of those in many instances are causing an increase in the non-communicable diseases. Less well understood are things like the fact that poor water resource management, sea level rise, and more extreme storms is causing saltwater intrusion into coastal aquifers in Bangladesh, for example, and that saltwater intrusion into those coastal aquifers is leading to increased salinity in the groundwater, which is then leading to an increased rate of preeclampsia in pregnant women. It's also leading to an increased rate of hypertension among adults in coastal Bangladesh. And so these are non-intuitive, complex sort of systems-based effects that would have been hard to anticipate. We're seeing steady rises in the number of displaced people around the world. Clearly, that's multifactorial. It's not just environmental change, but this year, was something like the third or fourth year in a row that we had record numbers of displaced people around the world and the highest number of displaced people since the beginning of UNHCR record keeping. And there are effects on mental health. And this is an area that's really not been well researched yet and needs to be better researched. But you look at the news in the last 3 weeks, you look at the floods there in Germany and the Netherlands, you look at the floods in China, the deaths from the monsoon in India, the temperature regimes here in the United States and the Pacific Northwest that are simply inconsistent with the entire instrumental record of temperature in that region. The fires that are burning across our country that are leading to haze 3,000 miles away on the East Coast. And you have to wonder, what is the mental health burden of feeling like somehow our activities are really causing our natural systems to begin to crumble, and our own consumption patterns are putting the most vulnerable people and future generations in harm's way. And what is the burden that we carry from a mental health standpoint of that sort of awakening knowledge? So the point is that there, across every dimension of health, are really important impacts from these kinds of global environmental change on human health. And when you start to think about, so what do we do about this growing problem that may ultimately be responsible for the majority of the global burden of disease by the end of this century? How do we address this huge global health challenge? Really, the answer has to be to move way upstream and look at these, underlying drivers for changing and disrupting our natural systems. And so that leads to a lot of discussion of the need for humanity to get on fundamentally a different trajectory. We need to change the way we live. It's not only about addressing climate change, but it's about addressing our food systems, our energy systems, the way we manufacture goods, and embracing the circular economy, the need for green chemistry in the chemical industry, the need for the way we design our cities and the way we live in those cities. There's an enormous potential to reduce our ecological footprint. So really across the board, there's a need for what we call the great transition, or this sort of deep, rapid structural shift in how human beings are living on Earth in order to regenerate the natural systems that fundamentally we depend on for our health and well-being. So let me stop there and make one sort of observation, which is that's a huge amount of very complex systems science. It can feel overwhelming when an audience first hears it. It can feel depressing. It's hard to take in. And so the challenge that I want to highlight is, how do you take a story that's that complex? And, you know, if I had 2 hours, I could have added a whole lot of nuance and provided a whole lot more sort of examples of how different kinds of environmental change affect different dimensions of health for different populations around the world. How do you take all of that and get it to a story that somebody in the general public can actually take in? So this video is our best attempt at doing that so far.
Yeah, I think we can start again now. So over to you
All
again.
right.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. So just a few sort of reflections before Q&A about this process. You know, as I said, the first presentation that I gave you that sort of laid out the science and the argument and the, you know, the trends, the graphs, the information, was how, you know, I started trying to communicate planetary health to people. And I think it works pretty well for an academic and scientific audience. When you try to communicate that to a general public audience, people's eyes glaze over, the complexity is hard to grasp, it's overwhelming, it's depressing, and you lose people very quickly. And to Sarah's point that providing information is not the same as communicating, we started to really think about a process that I think is really important. I mean, in some ways, I think science communication is almost an oxymoron in the case of planetary health, because the science is so complex and so overwhelming that it almost gets in the way of the communication. And so what we needed to do was try to figure out how we synthesize what we know from the science and how we translate it into narrative, into a story that people can grasp, that is simple, that's accessible, that engages not just the mind, but also the emotions, that's not judgmental, and that's hopeful. And so that's sort of what we were trying to do. And a few quick observations just about communicating planetary health from our own experience. And we're very new at this and very young. And I certainly don't think we haven't cracked the code. We don't know how to do this at all. So we're looking forward to learning from all of you. But our observations so far, first of all, just the definition of planetary health loses a lot of people. So still all over the world, when people talk about planetary health, they often talk about planetary and human health as if they're two different things. And what we mean by planetary health is not the health of the planet. Planets are inanimate objects. They don't have health. What we mean is human health as it's impacted by our planet's natural systems and by our changes in those natural systems. So defining it and making it clear that what we're talking about is human health and the human health impacts of environmental change is really important. A second observation is that you really, in some ways, for the general public, can boil the narrative down to the fact that we're really essentially fighting for the future of humanity and life on Earth, that there is a deep urgency to this field, and that fundamentally what planetary health science is teaching us is that the current trajectory we're on is simply inconsistent with a safe future for human health and well-being or much of the rest of life on Earth. A third thing that I think is really important is to avoid a lot of finger wagging. I think the environmental community is often created villains, and there's a lot of blame, and I think that turns people off. The fact is that human beings are both the hero and the villain in this story. That it's our activities have led to these environmental disruptions, and it will be our activities and our innovations that get us out of the position we're in. But fundamentally, what human beings have been doing is what all species do, which is to appropriate our natural environment towards our own goals. The problem is that we're now doing it at a scale which is inconsistent with a healthy future for ourselves. So we need to shift our trajectory, but there's no need to do a lot of sort of finger wagging in the process of communicating that message. Another observation is that we're embedded in nature, and that this sort of idea of human exceptionalism, the idea that we can be fully distinct from the natural world, is a myth, and that we need to challenge, I think, that myth. We also, I think, need to acknowledge the emotional and the spiritual dimension of this. A dry, information-laden presentation that speaks only to the facts but not to the heart isn't going to penetrate, at least within the general public, I don't think, effectively, nor motivate action. I guess one other observation is that I think the issue of equity and fairness is really central to the planetary health story, and that planetary health science really puts the issues of equity into stark relief, that fundamentally it's the consumption practices of the wealthiest people in the world that are putting the poorest people in the world, people of color, indigenous communities, and future generations into harm's way. And there's a deep unfairness about that situation, which I think resonates with people when they really understand it. And finally, I would just say that I think hope is absolutely critical in effectively communicating planetary health. I think the environmental community in general has been guilty of a lot of apocalyptic and catastrophic messaging that leaves people with very little hope, and therefore simply turns them off to whatever it is that we're trying to communicate. And that laying out an aspirational future and helping people to understand what a beautiful and exciting world we could be living in 100 years from now, if we get these solutions right, is absolutely critical to motivating action. So let me stop there and have some Q&A if people are interested.
Again, it's very difficult to pick one, but I would like to pick up the question of Amaya Blanco, who asked, is it true that it's too late to take action, that there is no way back to what we've done? I think this is also interesting because today we are like celebrating Earth Overshoot Day, and there are always like, also difficult messages in the public where sometimes it is said that we already reached the tipping points, and so many tipping points, and that can cause also a kind of uncertainty among the people. Is it really worth to fight any longer? Do we have a chance? What do you think? And perhaps also how do we can communicate about this this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that question comes up a lot, and I think it's one of the challenges of the kind of communication that I was describing earlier, of the sort of apocalyptic, communication of, the sort of Jim Hansen saying game over for the planet, that we've already sort of passed the threshold. I personally think that it's a really irresponsible kind of a statement. I don't believe at all that it's too late. I think that there's an absolutely enormous amount that we can do. I think it's, one fact, in the decade ending in 2010, 1/3 of the world's new energy production was renewable. 10 years later, in the decade ending in 2020, 2/3 of global new energy production was renewable. You look at what's happened in the past year and the announcements of electric vehicles and all of the huge automobile companies that are transitioning entirely to electric vehicles. The fact that renewable energy is actually less expensive to produce than fossil fuel energy. They're across the board. You look at the protein revolution in the food system, or applications like Too Good to Go, which started in Europe and is now in the United States to address food waste. I mean, there are story after story after story, and the fact is that there's an enormously rich landscape of solutions across food systems, energy systems, manufacturing, zero waste platforms, green chemistry, urban design. And so it's a matter of embracing those solutions. Is it too late to prevent suffering? Yes. I mean, there's suffering happening now. We're seeing it all over the world this month. Is it too late to avoid extinguishing species? Yes, it is. So there will be suffering and there will be some loss, but it's not binary. Where it's either too late or it's not too late. The fact is, the longer we wait, the more slowly we make these structural shifts, the more human suffering there'll be, and the more species will be extinguished through our activities. And so there's urgency, but it's absolutely not too late. And I think it's, I think there's every reason to believe that we could have a very positive aspirational future in which we get these solutions right, and the world that our grandchildren are living in is a very bright world. So it's really just a matter of how long are we going to wait, and how much suffering are we going to allow to happen before we take these problems seriously.
Thank you so much, Sam. And I think we're running out of time now. But people will have a chance to continue the conversation now in the breakout rooms. And Julia will explain in a second how that's going to work. In fact, nobody really talks about the fact that more than 50% of the plastic in the oceans is fishing equipment and nets and so on. And because that's not convenient for certain industries to discuss. So how much should we be focusing on individual behavior change, and how much on the need to actually mobilize political change, regulatory change, and so on?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I get asked all the time, okay, so, if I become a vegetarian, is that going to make a difference? And I used to be almost as dismissive as Michael about individual behavior change, because I agree that, changing out our light bulbs or eating vegetarian even isn't going to get there given the scale of the problems that we face. But I actually think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because I think individual behavior change can also be sort of a gateway to collective behavior change. And so I think being dismissive about individuals' ability to make a difference is not helpful in engaging the public in addressing these problems. And so what I tend to do when people sort of ask about solutions is to emphasize, at the individual level, that there are sort of three areas you can focus on. You can do sort of a personal audit of how you live, and that can include, the energy efficiency of the building that you live in, and how you get around to work, and what you eat, and how many children you have, and how you vacation, and all of those kinds of questions. And you can try to reduce the ecological footprint of your personal audit. The second area is sort of how you engage with the world professionally, whether you're a student, what you choose to do for a career, or what's the ecological footprint of the business where you work, or the organization where you are. Are you doing something to help this great transition through your professional life? And then the third dimension is sort of find your partner, which is collective action. That clearly individual action isn't going to get us there. And so how can you be part of a social movement? How can you build power collectively? Because many of, if not all of the problems, or at least most of the problems that we face in planetary health, are what Marshall Gans would call power problems, not knowledge problems, that fundamentally we're dealing with a lot of entrenched interests that oppose the kind of rapid structural shifts that we believe we need. And so the way to address power problems is by building power on the other side, which requires collective action and movement building. But I think that there is I think that there's a sort of a gradient there, that it's not as distinct as either individual or collective. I think that taking individual actions and becoming engaged and starting to feel some agency, and then finding your partners and taking on sort of collective action are all part of a spectrum. So I don't think it's as sort of one versus the other so much as start with the individual and move to the collective.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Sabine, you just raised your hand. Go for it.
Thank you. Hi, Sam. Nice to see you. Can you guys hear me? Yes, yep. Cool. I'm interested in this spiritual dimension, as you called it. And of course, it's a bit of a slippery slope for scientists to some degree. And kind of wondering what your thoughts are for, like, of course, the Earthrise picture is kind of very emotional and moving and works quite well. Also, the in vivo planetary health uses it a lot, but also other narratives that show the connectedness of humans with other life and so on. But like, which directions are you kind of brainstorming there for bringing that sort of aspect in? I'd be curious.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in spirituality or faith traditions for sure. So I'm feeling my way as we go. But I think there's been a progression in my thinking where, you start to understand the scale of the ecological crisis, and then planetary health embodies the recognition that the ecological crisis is driving a global health crisis. And you start to wrap your head around that crisis. And then for me, you start to wonder, how is it that human beings, most of whom actually experience something like reverence or awe in beautiful natural settings, how have we been willing for that reverence and that awe to lose their agency in guiding our decisions collectively? Even if we feel those things individually, how did it become okay to treat our oceans as a gigantic garbage bin, or our atmosphere as a gigantic garbage bin? How did it become okay to extinguish life on Earth? And that's where I start to wonder if underneath the ecological and the global health crisis, there's also a spiritual crisis, that we've sort of lost a sense of connectedness to the natural world. And it's gotten me thinking about this concept of human exceptionalism, and that somewhere we swallowed a story that human beings are distinct from the rest of the natural world, and that nature is there for our taking and dominion, and that we accepted the myth that we can be independent of the natural world. And so in some ways, the spiritual and the scientific are all very much intertwined in my head, because I feel like it's a scientific understanding from planetary health research that we are embedded in the natural world. We're seeing and quantifying the health effects of disrupting our natural systems. We actually scientifically are not distinct from our natural systems. We're very much dependent on them. And then you look at, other indigenous traditions, indigenous knowledges, certain faith traditions that have a whole, experience with that interconnectedness with nature. So I guess it's gotten me feeling that fundamentally we need to reject a story we've been told, and I think we've been told it in many instances by corporations. In some instances, it's inherent in some of our faith traditions. That we have this sort of limitless capacity to just use nature for our own well-being. And I think we've also been told this story about what makes us happy that we need to reject, that, what makes us happy is sort of acquiring more and more and more and more stuff, when we actually know, again, scientifically from our social scientist colleagues, that what makes us happy is being with the people we love, being in places that we cherish, working towards something greater than ourselves. And so there's a need to kind of reject some of these wrong myths and back to things that we've known for millennia but moved away from. And I do think there is a sort of spiritual dimension to that, but I'm not quite sure where the science ends and the spiritual starts. It's all very intertwined in my own head.
Thank you. So Johanna Conterio, would you like to ask a question?
Oh, yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm afraid the video is not working today. So I have a question a bit about the context of your research from a historical, like the historical context of your research. As a historian of medicine, I can say that part of the reason why we lack knowledge about the interrelationship between the human body and the environment is due to policy decisions about what kind of medical knowledge gets funded, and that in turn is shaped by the interests of producers of toxic pollutions. So I'm just wondering about how this looks today. What has changed to make this new perspective possible for research, and also how whether you still continue to see the influence of sort of counter research that undermines the idea of the interconnectedness of the body and the natural environment, as sort of counter narratives, sort of trying agendas attempting to undermine the concepts of planetary health.
Well, thank you for that question. And we actually have a whole sort of history of medicine chapter in the book that Michael John mentioned, written by Warwick Anderson, who you'll probably know as another historian of medicine, that sort of explores the origins of planetary health. But in terms of your question about funding agencies, there's no question that the structure of funding in the United States, and as I understand it in many other countries, is not supportive of planetary health research, primarily because it's so siloed. So in the United States, we have the National Institutes of Health for health research, and we have the National Science Foundation for natural sciences research, and they're quite distinct. And if you say that you want to do research on how changes in natural systems affect the health of a population, the NSF will tell you to go to NIH, and NIH will tell you to go to NSF. And in fact, I just helped to write a new report to the National Science Foundation about that gap and the need for collaboration across these disciplines. So that's one problem. I don't know whether that's because of capture by corporations, or whether it's actually just a reflection of this kind of very 19th century way of dividing the world up into disciplines. I mean, our universities are structured the same way, and it's also problematic. So it's not just our funding agencies, but the way we train our scientists, the way they're rewarded, the way they're promoted, all of that is done in a very siloed, disciplinary way that does not encourage planetary health research. And to your question about whether there's funded research to sort of cast doubt on the planetary health work, I'm not so aware of that kind of research. I don't think that's really what the sort of misinformation campaigns tend to do. I don't think they do a lot of research to show that climate change is actually good for your health. I think they just, or other kinds of global environmental change, I think what they do is just make a lot of statements. And I have been in a position where my own research on how rising carbon dioxide makes our food less nutritious and imperils human nutrition around the world. There are Republican senators who've been claiming in the United States that carbon dioxide is fantastic for global food production, and because of the CO2 fertilization effect, it's going to be terrific for global food security. And I've had to sort of counter those arguments. So there's definitely misinformation out there, but I don't see it coming from really research funding. I think they skip that step entirely and just make a lot of unfounded assertions.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
Thank you, Michael John. I think you were first one to put your hand up.
I was, but I would like to let someone else who hasn't spoken yet.
Okay, then Eva Maria Schwienhorst-Stich, you go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you, Sam. I'd like to come back to what you said about you find it irresponsible to talk about catastrophes. And while I personally can resonate very much with a positive vision and more close contact to nature, I see many people don't. They just don't. This is not a communication pathway for them at all. And I realized that in the past 2 weeks with the catastrophe in Germany, there are much more communication pathways now to see that, okay, we're all in the same boat here, and create a positive vision can mean realizing that actually our common future is in danger for everyone everywhere. And so the positive vision is avoiding that this will happen everywhere regularly on a large scale. So I think sometimes while I'm very favor of creating a positive vision, sometimes you just have to talk about what is at stake in order to create this communication pathway. So I wonder what your reflections are on that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful for that question, because if I left you with the impression that I think we should not talk about the dangers that we face on our current course, then I must have misspoken, because I completely agree with you that you can't be sort of Pollyanna-ish and say, oh, everything's going to be terrific. You know, there are 2 steps to this communication. And the first step is the diagnosis of the problem. And the problem is, you know, enormous and scary. And what's at stake is enormous and scary. And it's the future of humanity, as well as most of life on Earth. And the trajectory that we're on is inconsistent with a happy future for humanity or life on Earth. And I think you have to be very clear in showing the science and making that understood, that the stakes are very, very high. I just think that you can't stop there. That if you stop there, you lose your audience. You terrify people and depress them, and they turn off. So the next step is to talk about the solutions. And I believe that it's a factual statement that there is an incredibly rich terrain of solutions, and there is a lot to be hopeful for. And what's so fascinating to me about this particular moment in human history is that it comes down to what we in this generation and the next generation decide to do. So we don't have a crystal ball. We could end up in one of those sort of apocalyptic versions of the future, or we could end up in a much happier, more aspirational vision of the future. And it depends entirely on what we do. And it's why we sort of end that video with, you know, we know what to do. In other words, we know what the solutions are, but will we do it? Do we have the political will as a global community to make these sort of deep structural shifts in how we live? So I totally agree with you. I think you've got to hold that understanding of what's at stake. And then in the same hand, you've got to be able to say, it's up to us and our actions right now.
Thank you.
I believe it's your turn now, Michael John.
Yeah, great. Well, I suppose it's some version of Godwin's law, but I'm surprised that nobody has got into COVID-19 and planetary health yet in this discussion. But I think it's clearly when in the early days of COVID-19, we had there was a lot of discussion about spillover and so on, and how COVID-19 was the perfect kind of case to demonstrate the interrelation between changing land use and intrusion on wild spaces and wild species and so on, and human health through pandemics. and all of this discussion about you know, the pangolin in the early days of corona as an intermediate species potentially, which then now has become a little bit more complicated in the discussions about the origins of COVID-19, and you know, particularly recently in the more serious discussions about the, you know, potential lab leak hypothesis and so on. How do you see that affecting the kind of global public discussion around planetary health? Number one, and if I may sneak in a small second question, there's a certain amount of competition now between a few similar terms like planetary health, along with One Health, or eco health is also used in some quarters. And why is planetary health the right frame to explore among these three? So sorry for cheekily asking you two questions, but be very interested in your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the first question about COVID, I've always felt like it's a slightly complicated question. I think that COVID-19 illustrates that there's a huge risk in spillover events from wildlife populations. And we know that there are a lot of ways that human activities are leading to those kinds of spillover events. So there are incursions into wildlife habitat, there's bushmeat hunting, there's live animal trade. And all of those events have been, or those mechanisms have been associated with spillover events. There was a huge push with COVID-19 to sort of connect planetary health and the pandemic. And I think there are a lot of communities that were trying to sort of make the case that their issue was connected to the pandemic because that's what the world was focused on, and it was slightly opportunistic. And I have really resisted that with COVID because I think, in fact, it's not a result of our disruption of natural systems. The pandemic is either a result of live animal markets in Wuhan, which we've known for decades were super risky because they put all of these different species together in very close proximity, which, you know, is an invitation for the kind of spillover events you're talking about, from bats to pangolins to people. And we're not exactly sure what the pathway was, but, you know, it's what we saw with SARS, and we were highlighting these live animal markets back then. But that's not a natural system. A live animal market in China, it's an artificial system where we bring all these animals together. Or, as you say, it may be a lab accident. So I think I think pandemics in general are one potential manifestation of a very risky relationship to wildlife species. But I guess what's bothered me a little bit is in trying to focus so heavily on, you know, COVID as an example. Meanwhile, we have this sort of silent pandemic, right, of all of these enormous human health impacts that are going on as a result of shifting environmental conditions around food security, the number of displaced people in the world, the non-communicable diseases, you know, 11 million people a year dying from pollution. You know, so there are a lot of ways in which global environmental change are clearly affecting human health right now. And I think certainly pandemics are one risk. Other kinds of shifts in infectious disease are also a huge risk. I mean, malaria from deforestation and nutrient enrichment of certain coastal systems. You know, I mentioned schistosomiasis, and there are lots of ways in which changing environmental conditions affect infectious disease exposures that aren't pandemics. So I just think we have to be a little bit careful about, in terms of credibility, making sure that the science, I don't think the science tells us that the COVID pandemic per se came out of our disruption of nature. In fact, it was because we created a natural environment in these live animal markets, probably. In terms of your question about terminology and One Health and eco health, I think it's really, really important to actually look at what these fields have been, because I think they're actually pretty distinct. And One Health is a super, super important field. It really emerged out of the veterinary medical community. Maybe Sabine can speak more about it potentially, but and it has a very sharp focus on zoonotic infectious diseases, on diseases that are transmitted between animals and people, both wildlife and domesticated livestock. And if you look at journals of One Health, like ironically the journal EcoHealth, which is really a One Health journal, but pretty much every article in that journal is about zoonotic infectious diseases. If you go to One Health meetings, usually the abstracts and the talks are about these different super interesting manifestations where changing environmental conditions can alter relationships between people and animals and lead to exposure to these infectious diseases. And so I see it as a sort of branch within planetary health. It's a focus area within planetary health that's specifically about zoonotic infectious diseases. Now, there are a lot of other kinds of infectious diseases, like vector-borne infectious diseases, that are also being impacted by environmental change. And then there are all the other dimensions of health, like nutrition, mental health, non-communicable diseases, displacement and conflict, that haven't historically been really addressed in One Health. So to me, I think the relationship is that One Health is this sort of vibrant area of research in a more focused part of planetary health. And then EcoHealth has been around as a term. I think it's practically a synonym for planetary health. It's, if you go back to that community and the International Society for Ecology and Health and the EcoHealth meetings, they've really focused on changes in natural systems, environmental conditions, as well as human and animal health. Historically, it's been a little bit more academic and sort of the scale's been different. And this is why when I started my talk today, I mentioned that I think planetary health, the context in which it emerged was really important, that it's a field that sort of forged in urgency, and it came out of this moment and the sense that all of human health is being threatened by the scale at which we're transforming natural systems, whereas EcoHealth has tended to look at sort of specific examples of ways that an environmental change would affect an aspect of human health. But that's sort of splitting hairs. I think they're relatively similar.
Thank you. So
ask your question, Jörg.
Yeah, go for it. So the breakout room will close in 30 seconds and we'll be thrown back in the main room, but feel free to do whatever you want until then. Sabina, did you want to ask a question, or you're?
I said quickly ask your question, Jörg.
Yes, please. Fast, now or never.
Yeah, it was coming back to you, Sabine, because I was wondering, like, isn't it a really Western approach to only allow science as the approach to gather knowledge? I mean, spirituality is also a different approach for knowledge and truth, and shouldn't we like incorporate that as well?